When I first moved to Chicago, I was beyond excited. I'd landed a job at a small tech startup in the Loop, and after weeks of searching, I finally found the perfect apartment in the Lakeview neighborhood. It was a charming, older building with character. You know, the kind with creaky hardwood floors and those beautiful bay windows that let in tons of natural light. The rent was a bit steep, but hey, it was worth it for the location alone. I mean, being just a stone's throw away from Wrigley Field and having Lake Michigan practically in my backyard. It felt like a dream come true. The first few weeks were amazing. I spent my weekends exploring the neighborhood, finding my new favorite coffee shops and bars. There was this great little place called the Long Room on Irving Park Road that became my go-to spot for a relaxing drink after work. And don't even get me started on the food scene. I was in heaven with all the options, from the deep dish pizza at Lou Malnati's to the incredible tacos at Big Star in Wicker Park. My neighbors seemed pretty cool, too. There was a young couple next door who were always friendly, offering tips about the best local spots. The lady across the hall was a bit older, probably in her 50s, and she had the cutest little pug that would always try to sneak into my apartment for belly rubs. Even the building superintendent, a gruff but kind-hearted guy named Mike, made me feel welcome. But then there was the guy living directly below me. Let's call him Tom. At first, I barely noticed him. He was this nondescript, middle-aged man who always seemed to be home. I'd catch glimpses of him coming and going, but he never really acknowledged me or anyone else in the building. I figured he was just shy or maybe worked from home. About a month into my stay, I started noticing some odd things. It began with noises coming from Tom's apartment at night. Now, I'm no stranger to apartment living. You expect to hear your neighbors sometimes, especially in an older building like this one. But these noises were different. They weren't the usual sounds of someone going about their day-to-day life. Instead, I'd hear what sounded like furniture being dragged across the floor, or muffled voices that didn't quite sound like a TV or radio. At first, I brushed it off. Maybe Tom was a night owl and liked rearranging his furniture at 2 a.m. Who was I to judge? But as the days went by, the noises became more frequent and, frankly, more disturbing. There were times when I swore I could hear something that sounded like chains rattling or worse, what seemed like muffled cries. I started losing sleep. I'd lie awake at night straining my ears, trying to make sense of the sounds coming from below. During the day, I'd find myself zoning out at work, my mind racing with possibilities. Was Tom okay? Was he having some kind of mental health crisis? Or was something more sinister going on? I debated whether to say something to Mike, the soup, but I hesitated. What if I was just being paranoid? I didn't want to be that annoying new tenant who complains about every little thing. Plus, I had no real evidence that anything was wrong, just some weird noises and a gut feeling. About 2 months into my stay, the noises got particularly bad one night. It was a Tuesday, I remember, because I had a big presentation at work the next day. I was trying to get some sleep, but the sounds from Tom's apartment were relentless. There was a constant scraping noise, like something heavy being dragged back and forth. And then I heard it, a sound that made my blood run cold. It was a muffled scream, quickly cut off. That was it. I couldn't ignore it anymore. Heart pounding, I got out of bed and put on some clothes. I paced back and forth in my living room for a few minutes, trying to work up the courage to do something. Finally, I took a deep breath and headed downstairs. Standing in front of Tom's door, I hesitated again. What if I was wrong? What if I was about to make a complete fool of myself? But then I heard another thud from inside the apartment, and before I could talk myself out of it, I knocked on the door. The noises inside immediately stopped. For a long moment, there was complete silence. I was about to knock again when I heard footsteps approaching the door. There was a pause, and then the door opened just a crack. Tom peered out at me. Even in the dim hallway light, I could see that he looked odd. His hair was disheveled, his eyes wide and slightly manic. He was breathing heavily, as if he'd just been running. I nervously asked if everything was okay, mentioning that I'd heard some strange noises. Tom's expression changed instantly. A forced smile appeared on his face, and he explained in an overly cheerful voice that he was just doing some late-night redecorating. He apologized for the noise and promised to keep it down. Something about his demeanor set off alarm bells in my head. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and there was a tension in his voice that seemed wrong. But what could I do? He hadn't actually done anything that I could prove was suspicious, so I just nodded, apologized for bothering him, and went back to my apartment. I didn't sleep at all that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening intently. But after our interaction, Tom's apartment had gone completely silent. Somehow that silence was even more unnerving than the noises had been. The next few days were uneventful. I didn't hear any more strange noises from Tom's apartment, but I also didn't see him around the building at all. I found myself watching his door whenever I passed it, half expecting. Well, I don't know what I was expecting, but something felt very, very wrong. About a week after the late-night incident, I ran into Mike the super in the lobby. We chatted for a bit, and then, trying to sound casual, I asked if he'd seen Tom lately. Mike's brow furrowed, and he mentioned that now that I brought it up, he realized he hadn't seen Tom in weeks. He'd been meaning to check on him, make sure everything was all right. That conversation sent a chill down my spine. Weeks? But I had just talked to Tom a few days ago. How was that possible? I must have looked pretty shaken because Mike asked if everything was okay. I hesitated for a moment, then spilled everything. The noises, the late-night encounter, my growing sense of unease. Mike listened intently, his expression growing more concerned by the second. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he thanked me for telling him and said he'd look into it. He advised me not to approach Tom's apartment again and to call the police if I heard anything alarming. The next day I came home from work to find police cars outside our building. My heart started racing as I approached. Had something happened? Was Tom okay? As I got closer, I saw Mike talking to a couple of officers. He spotted me and waved me over. In a low voice, he explained that, after our conversation, he'd tried to contact Tom. When he got no response, he'd used his master key to check the apartment. What he found? Well, it was bad enough that he immediately called the police. I stood there in shock as Mike explained that the police had found a hidden door in Tom's apartment. It led to a small, makeshift basement area that wasn't on any of the building's blueprints. And in that basement, they'd found a man, alive, but barely. He was a homeless person who had gone missing from the area weeks ago. Tom had been keeping him captive down there. The reality of what had been happening right below my feet hit me like a ton of bricks. All those noises, the muffled cries. It had all been real. Someone had been suffering, calling for help, and I'd done nothing for weeks. The next few days were a blur. There were police interviews, news reporters camped outside our building, and a constant buzz of activity as the investigation unfolded. They found Tom a few days later, trying to flee the state. The full extent of what he'd done came to light, and it was even worse than we'd initially thought. I couldn't stay in that apartment after that. The thought of living above that hidden room, knowing what had happened there, it was too much. I broke my lease and moved out within a week, finding a new place in Lincoln Park. It took a long time before I felt comfortable in my new home, before I stopped analyzing every little sound I heard from my neighbors. When I first moved to Seattle for my new job at a tech startup, I was both excited and nervous. It was my first time living in the Pacific Northwest, and I wasn't sure what to expect. After weeks of searching, I finally found a cute little house to rent in the Ballard neighborhood. It was a charming craftsman-style home with a small front porch and a backyard that seemed perfect for summer barbecues. The day I moved in was sunny, which I quickly learned was a rarity in Seattle. As I was unloading boxes from the U-Haul, I noticed an older woman watching me from the house next door. She waved and made her way over, introducing herself as Linda. She looked to be in her late 60s or early 70s, with silver hair and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. Linda immediately struck me as the quintessential sweet old lady. She welcomed me to the neighborhood and offered to help me unpack. I politely declined, not wanting to burden her, but she insisted on at least bringing over some homemade cookies later. True to her word, she showed up that evening with a plate of the most delicious chocolate chip cookies I'd ever tasted. Over the next few weeks, Linda and I fell into a comfortable routine. She'd often invite me over for coffee in the mornings before work, and we'd chat about everything from the local farmers market to her grandkids in Florida. She seemed to know everything about the neighborhood and was always full of helpful tips about the best places to eat or which days the nearby parks had free concerts. I have to admit, it was nice having someone looking out for me in a new city. Linda would water my plants when I went on short business trips, and she'd always check in if she noticed I hadn't left for work at my usual time. It felt like having a surrogate grandmother next door. One Saturday, about a month after I'd moved in, Linda invited me over for her weekly bridge game with some other ladies from the neighborhood. I wasn't much for card games, but I figured it would be a good way to meet more people. The afternoon was pleasant enough, filled with gossip about local happenings and Linda's amazing baked goods. As the weeks went by, I started to notice some odd things happening around my house. At first, it was small stuff. A book on my coffee table that I could have sworn I'd left in the bedroom, or my favorite mug being in a different cabinet than where I usually kept it. I chalked it up to being forgetful or just still getting used to my new space. But then things started to get weirder. One day I came home from work to find all my throw pillows rearranged on the couch. Another time I noticed that some of my clothes in the closet had been reordered. It was subtle, but enough to make me feel uneasy. I started paying more attention to my surroundings, double-checking that I'd locked the doors and windows before leaving for work. I even considered setting up a security camera, but I felt a bit silly. After all, nothing was missing, and there were no signs of forced entry. Maybe I was just being paranoid. Linda seemed to pick up on my unease. She started asking if everything was okay, mentioning that I seemed distracted during our morning coffee chats. I brushed it off, not wanting to sound crazy by admitting I thought someone might be sneaking into my house just to rearrange my stuff. One Friday, I decided to take a day off work. I'd been feeling under the weather and thought a long weekend might help me recharge. I didn't mention it to anyone, figuring I'd just sleep in and maybe binge-watch some shows on Netflix. Around 10 a.m., I was lounging on the couch in my pajamas when I heard a key turning in my front door. My heart started racing. I hadn't given anyone a spare key, not even Linda. I quickly ducked behind the couch, trying to stay quiet as I heard the door open and close. Soft footsteps made their way through the living room and into the kitchen. I heard cabinet doors opening and closing, the fridge being opened, and then more movement throughout the house. It went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes. Just as I was working up the courage to confront the intruder, I heard a familiar voice humming a tune. It was Linda. My sweet, grandmotherly neighbor was the one who had been coming into my house. I was shocked and confused. How did she have a key? Why was she in my house? I stood up from behind the couch, causing Linda to let out a startled yelp. She was holding a vase of fresh flowers, apparently in the process of placing them on my dining room table. Linda's face went through a range of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, and then something that looked almost like anger. But it quickly settled into a sheepish smile. She started explaining that she had a spare key for emergencies and that she'd just been trying to help out by tidying up a bit and making sure everything was okay. I was too stunned to respond at first. Linda kept talking, saying how she'd noticed I seemed stressed lately and thought some fresh flowers might cheer me up. She mentioned that she'd been doing this for weeks, just little things to make my life easier. Rearranging the throw pillows so they looked nicer, organizing my closet, even restocking my fridge with fresh produce. As she spoke, I felt a growing sense of violation. This woman, who I'd thought was just a kind neighbor, had been essentially breaking into my house on a regular basis. She'd been going through my things, moving my stuff around, all without my knowledge or consent. I managed to keep my composure as I asked Linda to leave, telling her that while I appreciated her intentions, entering my home without permission was not okay. She seemed genuinely surprised that I was upset, insisting that she was just trying to help. It took some firm words, but I finally got her out of the house. Once she was gone, I immediately called a locksmith to change all the locks. I spent the rest of the day going through my house, trying to figure out exactly what Linda had done or moved. It was unsettling to realize how much she'd been in my personal space without me knowing. The next few weeks were tense. Linda kept trying to apologize, leaving notes in my mailbox and knocking on my door. I avoided her as much as possible, giving short, polite responses when I couldn't escape an interaction. Some of the other neighbors seemed confused by the sudden change in our relationship, but I didn't feel comfortable explaining the situation to them. I started to notice other things too. Sometimes when I'd come home from work, I'd see Linda's curtains quickly close, as if she'd been watching for me. If I had friends over, she'd often find an excuse to come by, usually with some baked goods or a quick question about something in the neighborhood. The whole situation made me incredibly uncomfortable in my own home. I started spending more time out, exploring other parts of Seattle just to avoid being in the house. I'd go for long walks in Discovery Park, or spend hours at cafes in Capitol Hill. Anything to not be near Linda. I considered moving, but I'd signed a year-long lease, and breaking it would be expensive. Plus, I really liked my job and the city itself. I didn't want one creepy neighbor to ruin my entire Seattle experience. Instead, I decided to take some precautions. I installed a security system with cameras covering all entrances to the house. I started being more careful about closing my blinds and curtains. I even joined a local community group to meet more people in the area, hoping to build a network that didn't revolve around Linda. As time went on, Linda's attempts to reconnect became less frequent. She still watched me from her window sometimes, but she stopped trying to engage me in conversation or invite me over. Part of me felt guilty. She was an old woman who probably just wanted company. But then I'd remember how violated I felt when I realized she'd been sneaking into my house, and the guilt would fade. I still live in that house in Ballard. Linda is still my neighbor, though our interactions are now limited to polite nods if we happen to be outside at the same time. The experience changed the way I approach new relationships, making me more cautious but also more appreciative of the genuine friendships I've since formed in Seattle. The city has become home now, despite that rocky start. I've found my favorite spots: the cozy bookstore in Fremont, the amazing Thai place in the International District, the quiet corner of Golden Gardens where I like to watch the sunset. I've made friends through work and local meetups, people I can trust without worrying about hidden agendas. Upon my initial move to Atlanta, I was excited to embark on this new chapter of my life. I'd landed a job at a marketing firm in Midtown, and after weeks of searching, I finally found a cozy townhouse in the Virginia Highland neighborhood. It was a charming area with tree-lined streets, cute cafes, and that perfect mix of urban convenience and residential quiet. My townhouse was on a street with a row of similar houses, all with small front yards and porches. Across the street were older, single-family homes with bigger yards. It was on my first day moving in that I noticed Mr. Thompson. He lived in the house directly across from mine, a well-maintained craftsman with a wide front porch. Mr. Thompson looked to be in his late 60s or early 70s, with thinning gray hair and thick glasses. As I was unloading boxes from the moving truck, I caught sight of him standing at his front window, watching the activity on the street. At first, I didn't think much of it. Moving day is always a bit of a spectacle, and I figured he was just curious about his new neighbor. I waved, trying to be friendly, but he didn't wave back. He just kept staring, his expression unreadable behind the glare on his glasses. Over the next few days, as I settled into my new home and routine, I started to notice a pattern. Every morning as I left for work, Mr. Thompson would be at his window, and every evening when I returned, there he was again. Always in the same spot, always watching. I tried to brush it off. Maybe he was retired and didn't have much else to do. Or perhaps he was one of those neighborhood watch types, keeping an eye out for any suspicious activity. I even considered that he might have some kind of mobility issue that kept him homebound. But as the days turned into weeks, Mr. Thompson's constant presence at the window started to unnerve me. It wasn't just that he was always there. It was the intensity of his gaze. He never smiled or waved or gave any indication that he saw me as a person rather than an object to observe. I started varying my routine, leaving for work at different times or taking different routes to my car. But no matter when I left or how I approached my house, Mr. Thompson was always there watching. One Saturday, about a month after I'd moved in, I decided to do some gardening in my small front yard. It was a beautiful spring day, and I figured some fresh air and sunshine would do me good. As I knelt in the soil, planting some flowers, I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I looked up and sure enough there was Mr. Thompson at his window, but this time something was different. He had binoculars. I froze, my hands deep in the dirt, as I watched him adjust the lenses clearly focused on me. A chill ran down my spine, and I quickly gathered my gardening tools and hurried inside. That incident marked a turning point. What had been a vague unease now bloomed into full-fledged anxiety. I started keeping my curtains closed at all times, even during the day. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, constantly checking over my shoulder whenever I was outside my house. I considered talking to Mr. Thompson directly, but something always held me back. There was an intensity to his staring that made me wary of confronting him. Plus, what could I really say? He wasn't doing anything explicitly threatening, just watching. I tried talking to some of my other neighbors about Mr. Thompson. Most of them just shrugged it off, saying he was harmless, just a bit odd. One lady mentioned that he'd lived there for decades and had always been a loner. No one seemed particularly concerned about his behavior. As spring turned to summer, I found myself spending less and less time at home. I'd stay late at work, go to the gym, meet friends for dinner, anything to avoid being in my house. When I was home, I felt like I was living in a fishbowl, always on display. I started exploring more of Atlanta, trying to find places where I could relax without feeling watched. I spent hours wandering through Piedmont Park, losing myself in the greenery and the bustle of people enjoying the outdoors. I became a regular at the High Museum of Art, finding solace in the quiet galleries and the beauty of the artwork. I even started taking salsa dancing classes at a studio in Little Five Points, hoping the physical activity and social interaction would help take my mind off my unsettling neighbor. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the thought of Mr. Thompson's watchful gaze was always lurking in the back of my mind. I'd catch myself scanning crowds, half expecting to see him there with his binoculars. Even when I was out with friends, I'd sometimes feel that familiar prickle on the back of my neck, as if I was being observed. One day I decided to take a mental health day off work. I didn't announce it to anyone, figuring I'd just enjoy a quiet day at home. Around midday, I was in my living room reading a book when movement across the street caught my eye. Mr. Thompson was leaving his house. It was the first time I'd ever seen him outside. He walked with a slight limp, leaning heavily on a cane. He made his way slowly down his front walk and then, to my shock, started crossing the street towards my house. My heart started racing. What was he doing? Should I pretend I wasn't home? But before I could decide, he was at my front door, knocking firmly. For a long moment, I just stood there, frozen in indecision. Then, taking a deep breath, I went to answer the door. I opened it just a crack, keeping the chain on. Mr. Thompson stood there, looking somehow smaller up close than he had from across the street. He introduced himself formally and then, to my surprise, apologized. He explained that he knew his behavior must have seemed odd to me. As he talked, the story came out. His wife had passed away 2 years ago, and since then he'd become increasingly isolated. Watching the neighborhood from his window had become his main connection to the outside world. He admitted that he'd become a bit obsessed with observing the routines of his neighbors, particularly me, since I was new to the street. He acknowledged that using the binoculars had been inappropriate and assured me he'd gotten rid of them. He explained that seeing me gardening that day had reminded him of his late wife, who had loved tending to their yard, and it had made him realize how much he'd withdrawn from the world. As he spoke, I felt my fear and anger slowly giving way to a mix of pity and understanding. This wasn't a malicious stalker, but a grieving, lonely old man who'd lost touch with normal social boundaries. We ended up talking for nearly an hour on my front porch. Mr. Thompson shared stories about the neighborhood's history, his late wife, and his struggles with isolation. By the end of the conversation, I felt like I finally understood the man behind the window. From that day on, things changed. Mr. Thompson made an effort to get out of his house more, often sitting on his front porch instead of watching from the window. He started attending neighborhood events and even joined a local senior center. As for me, I slowly began to feel comfortable in my home again. I still saw Mr. Thompson regularly, but now it was more likely to be a friendly wave as we both got our mail or a brief chat when we ran into each other at the local coffee shop. My life in Atlanta has settled into a comfortable rhythm now. I've made friends in the neighborhood, found my favorite local spots, and even grown to appreciate the sense of community on our street. Mr. Thompson is now just another friendly face in the tapestry of my daily life. a reminder that things aren't always what they seem at first glance. When I first bought my house in the Dallas suburb of Plano, I was over the moon. After years of apartment living, I finally had a place to call my own, a cute little ranch-style home with a decent-sized backyard and a 2-car garage. The neighborhood seemed perfect. Quiet streets lined with mature trees, well-maintained lawns, and friendly faces. I spent the first few weeks settling in, painting walls, arranging furniture, and trying to make the place feel like home. It was during this time that I first met Jake, my across-the-street neighbor. He was out mowing his lawn one Saturday morning when I was bringing in some groceries. He waved and came over to introduce himself. Jake seemed like the ideal neighbor at first. He was around my age, maybe early 30s, with an easy smile and a laid-back attitude. He offered to help me move some heavy furniture and even invited me to a neighborhood barbecue the following weekend. I was grateful for the warm welcome and excited about the prospect of making new friends in the area. The barbecue was a pleasant affair. I met several of my neighbors and started to feel like part of the community. Jake introduced me to everyone, cracking jokes and making sure I always had a full drink. He mentioned that he worked from home as a graphic designer, which explained why I often saw him around during the day. Over the next few weeks, Jake and I fell into a routine of casual friendliness. We'd chat in our front yards after work, discussing everything from local restaurants to the latest Netflix shows. Sometimes we'd grab a beer at a nearby sports bar to watch a Cowboys game. It was nice having a buddy so close by, especially being new to the area. But about a month into our neighborly friendship, I started noticing some odd things. The first incident was at the local grocery store. Tom Thumb. I was doing my weekly shopping when I bumped into Jake in the produce section. He seemed surprised to see me, mentioning that he usually shopped at a different store across town. It struck me as a bit odd, but I didn't think much of it at the time. A few days later, I was at the LA Fitness near my office in downtown Dallas, a good 20 miles from our neighborhood. As I was finishing up my workout, I spotted Jake on a treadmill. When he saw me, he waved enthusiastically and explained that he was trying out different gyms in the area. Again, it seemed a little strange, but I brushed it off. These coincidental meetings started happening more frequently. I'd see Jake at restaurants in Deep Ellum when I was out with work friends, or at the movie theater in North Park Center when I was on a date. Each time, he had a plausible explanation for why he was there, but a nagging feeling started to grow in the pit of my stomach. Then I began to notice his car. Jake drove a distinctive red Jeep Wrangler, easy to spot. I'd see it parked on my street when I left for work in the morning, which made sense since he worked from home. But then I started noticing it in the parking lot of my office building in downtown Dallas. The first time I convinced myself it was just a similar car, but after the third or fourth time, I couldn't deny it anymore. Jake was following me. The realization hit me hard. All those chance encounters weren't chance at all. Jake had been deliberately showing up at places he knew I'd be. But why? What did he want from me? I started paying more attention to Jake's behavior when we were in the neighborhood. I noticed that he always seemed to be outside when I was leaving for work or coming home. He'd wave casually, as if it was just a coincidence. But now I knew better. One evening, I was out for a run in the neighborhood when I saw Jake's red Jeep slowly cruising down the street. When he spotted me, he sped up and turned the corner. It was clear he hadn't expected me to be out at that time. The situation escalated when I started finding little notes in my mailbox. At first, they seemed innocuous, just friendly messages about neighborhood events or recommendations for local restaurants. But then they became more personal. Jake would mention things he'd seen me doing, like complimenting an outfit I'd worn to work or asking about a takeout meal I'd picked up the night before. The notes were the last straw. I knew I needed to do something, but I was scared. Jake hadn't done anything overtly threatening, but his behavior was clearly not normal. I didn't feel safe in my own home anymore. I decided to confide in another neighbor, Sarah, who lived a few houses down. She was shocked when I told her about Jake's behavior. She mentioned that Jake had lived in the neighborhood for years, but had always kept to himself before I moved in. This information only added to my unease. Sarah suggested I document everything and consider going to the police. I took her advice and started keeping a detailed log of every incident, every sighting, every note, every time I saw Jake's car where it shouldn't be. After a particularly unsettling incident where I came home to find Jake standing in my driveway, claiming he'd seen a suspicious person lurking around my house, I decided it was time to take action. I took my documentation to the Plano Police Department and filed a report. The police were sympathetic but explained that without direct threats or evidence of Jake entering my property, there wasn't much they could do. They suggested I consider getting a restraining order and offered to have an officer speak to Jake about his behavior. I decided to go ahead with the restraining order. The process was stressful, involving court appearances and having to recount all of Jake's unsettling behavior. But finally, I was granted a temporary order that prohibited Jake from coming within 100 feet of me, my home, or my workplace. When Jake was served with the order, things got worse before they got better. He became angry, accusing me of misunderstanding his friendliness and turning the neighborhood against him. He started telling other neighbors that I was paranoid and making things up. Some neighbors believed him, questioning why I was being so unfriendly to someone who was just trying to be nice. Others, like Sarah, stood by me and confirmed they'd witnessed Jake's odd behavior. The next few weeks were tense. Jake seemed to be constantly testing the boundaries of the restraining order, parking his car just beyond the 100-foot limit or accidentally running into me at the edge of the neighborhood. I invested in a security system for my house, complete with cameras covering every entrance. I also decided to change up my routine as much as possible. I started varying the times I left for work and came home. I found new routes to drive, new places to shop and work out. It was exhausting, but I felt it was necessary to shake Jake off my trail. Despite the restraining order, I still didn't feel entirely safe in my own home. I started spending more time at friends' houses or staying late at work. I even considered selling my house and moving, but the thought of giving up my dream home because of Jake made me angry. I had worked hard for this house, and I was determined not to let him drive me away. As time went on, Jake's behavior became more erratic. He'd alternate between ignoring me completely and finding ways to make his presence known just within the limits of the restraining order. Once I came home to find a bunch of flowers on my doorstep, with a card claiming they were from a secret admirer. I knew they were from Jake, but I couldn't prove it. The situation came to a head about 6 months after I'd gotten the restraining order. I woke up one night to the sound of my security alarm blaring. Terrified, I called 911 and locked myself in my bedroom. When the police arrived, they found Jake trying to break in through my back door. Jake was arrested on the spot. In his car, the police found a disturbing collection of items, photos of me, notes detailing my daily routine, and even some personal items that had gone missing from my yard over the past months. The aftermath of Jake's arrest was a whirlwind of police statements, court appearances, and meetings with lawyers. Jake was eventually charged with stalking, attempted breaking and entering, and violating the restraining order. He ended up taking a plea deal that involved jail time and mandatory psychiatric treatment. In the weeks and months that followed, I struggled to regain a sense of normalcy. Even with Jake in jail, I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see his red Jeep or catch a glimpse of him watching me. I started seeing a therapist to help deal with the anxiety and paranoia that the whole experience had left me with. My neighbors, even those who had initially doubted me, were incredibly supportive after Jake's arrest. They organized a neighborhood watch program and made a point of checking in on me regularly. Their support helped me feel safer and more connected to my neighbors. My home is truly my own now, a safe space that I've reclaimed and made peace with. And while I'll never forget what happened with Jake, I refuse to let it define my life or my relationship with people. Moving to Boston marked an exciting new chapter in my life. I'd landed a job at a tech startup in the Seaport District, and after weeks of searching, I finally found an affordable apartment in a small complex in the Fenway-Kenmore area. It wasn't fancy, but it was close to the T, and within walking distance of Fenway Park, which as a baseball fan I considered a major perk. The apartment complex was an older building, probably built in the 1960s or 70s, with about 20 units spread over 4 floors. My apartment was on the 3rd floor, a cozy one-bedroom with a small balcony overlooking the street. The day I moved in was chaotic, with boxes piled everywhere and me trying to direct the movers while also attempting to remember which neighbors I'd met during my brief visits. It was during this moving chaos that I first became aware of Mrs. Fitzgerald, my next-door neighbor. I didn't actually see her that day, but I heard a muffled voice through the wall, sounding annoyed at all the commotion. I made a mental note to apologize once I was settled in. Over the next few days, as I unpacked and started to settle into my new home and routine, I kept an eye out for Mrs. Fitzgerald, hoping to introduce myself properly. But I never seemed to catch her coming or going. I did, however, continue to hear noises from her apartment, footsteps, the TV playing softly, occasional coughing. After about a week, I decided to be proactive. I baked a batch of chocolate chip cookies. Okay, I bought pre-made dough and stuck it in the oven, but it's the thought that counts, right? And went to knock on Mrs. Fitzgerald's door. No answer. I tried again the next day, and the day after that, but still no response. I asked a couple of other neighbors about Mrs. Fitzgerald, but no one seemed to know much about her. The general consensus was that she was an elderly widow who kept to herself. One neighbor mentioned that she was a bit of a night owl, often heard moving around her apartment late at night. As the weeks went by, I fell into the rhythm of my new life in Boston. I was loving my job, exploring the city on weekends, and slowly making friends with some of my coworkers. But the mystery of Mrs. Fitzgerald lingered in the back of my mind. I continued to hear noises from her apartment, always at night. Footsteps pacing back and forth, the soft murmur of a TV or radio, sometimes what sounded like furniture being moved, but never during the day. And still, despite my repeated attempts, I never managed to catch her leaving her apartment or returning to it. About a month into my stay, I was coming home late one night after a work event. As I approached my door, I heard movement from Mrs. Fitzgerald's apartment. On an impulse, I knocked. The noises immediately stopped. I waited for a moment, then knocked again, louder this time. Still nothing. I started to feel a bit silly standing there in the hallway, knocking on my reclusive neighbor's door in the middle of the night. Just as I was about to give up and go into my own apartment, I heard a soft shuffling from inside. My heart leapt. Was Mrs. Fitzgerald finally going to answer? But the door remained closed. Instead, I heard what sounded like retreating footsteps, followed by the click of a lock. I stood there for a moment longer, bewildered and slightly unnerved. It was clear someone was in there. So why wouldn't they answer? The next day, I decided to talk to our building manager, Mr. Chen. I explained the situation, how I'd never seen Mrs. Fitzgerald but constantly heard noises from her apartment at night. Mr. Chen looked confused. He told me that as far as he knew, Mrs. Fitzgerald had moved out months ago, shortly before I moved in. The apartment was supposed to be empty. This information sent a chill down my spine. If Mrs. Fitzgerald had moved out, then who or what was making those noises in the supposedly empty apartment? Mr. Chen must have seen the look of alarm on my face because he quickly assured me he'd look into it. He promised to check the apartment himself and make sure everything was okay. That night, I lay awake in bed, straining my ears for any sound from next door. For the first time since I'd moved in, the apartment was completely silent. No footsteps, no TV, nothing. The silence was almost more unnerving than the usual noises had been. The next day, Mr. Chen caught me as I was leaving for work. He told me he'd checked Mrs. Fitzgerald's apartment and found it completely empty, just as it should. He suggested that perhaps the noises I'd been hearing were just the building settling or coming from another apartment. I wanted to believe him, I really did. But something about the whole situation felt off. Why had I heard someone inside when I knocked? Why had the noises suddenly stopped after I'd talked to Mr. Chen? Over the next few days, I found myself becoming hyper-aware of every sound in the building. I'd jerk awake at night at the slightest creak or thump. But Mrs. Fitzgerald's apartment remained silent. About a week after my conversation with Mr. Chen, I was working from home one day when I heard it. Footsteps from the apartment next door. My heart started racing. It was the middle of the day. I'd never heard noises from there during daylight hours before. Without really thinking it through, I grabbed my phone, ready to call 911 if needed, and went out into the hallway. I put my ear to Mrs. Fitzgerald's door and listened. The footsteps continued, moving from one end of the apartment to the other. Gathering all my courage, I knocked firmly on the door. The footsteps stopped abruptly. I knocked again, louder this time, and called out, asking if anyone was there. Silence. I don't know how long I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for a response that never came. Eventually, I went back to my own apartment, shaken and confused. That night, unable to sleep, I decided to do some research. I spent hours online looking up the history of our building, searching for any news articles about strange occurrences in the area. I found nothing out of the ordinary. As I was about to give up and try to get some sleep, a thought struck me. I searched for obituaries in the area, going back several months. And there it was, an obituary for Margaret Fitzgerald, aged 82, who had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The date of death was just 2 weeks before I had moved in. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Mrs. Fitzgerald hadn't moved out. She had died in the very apartment next to mine. But then who or what had been making those noises all this time? The next morning, running on little sleep and a lot of coffee, I cornered Mr. Chen and confronted him with what I'd found. At first, he tried to deny it, but when I showed him the obituary on my phone, he deflated. Mr. Chen admitted that Mrs. Fitzgerald had indeed passed away in her apartment. The family had cleared out most of her things, but there had been some delays in dealing with the rest of her estate. He had been going into the apartment every few days to check on things and air it out. As for the noises at night, Mr. Chen looked genuinely puzzled. He swore he had only been entering the apartment during the day, never at night. He suggested that perhaps one of Mrs. Fitzgerald's relatives had been coming by, but he couldn't be sure. This explanation should have put my mind at ease, but something still felt off. If family members were coming and going, why hadn't I ever seen them? And why only at night? Over the next few weeks, I found myself obsessing over the mystery. I started keeping a log of the noises I heard, noting the times and types of sounds. I even considered setting up a camera in the hallway, but decided that might be stepping over a line. The noises continued. Always at night, always when I was alone. I never managed to catch anyone coming or going, no matter how quickly I rushed to the door when I heard something. About 2 months after I discovered the truth about Mrs. Fitzgerald's death, things came to a head. It was a Friday night, and I had stayed in, binge-watching a new show on Netflix. Around midnight, I heard the now familiar sound of footsteps from next door. Something in me snapped. I'd had enough of the mystery, the fear, the sleepless nights. Without really thinking it through, I grabbed my spare key, which I knew from the lease worked on all the apartments, and marched next door. My hand shook as I put the key in the lock. Part of me was screaming to stop, to turn around and go back to my apartment, but a larger part needed to know, once and for all, what was going on. I turned the key and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, illuminated only by the streetlight filtering through the windows. I fumbled for a light switch and flicked it on. The apartment was empty. Not just unoccupied, but completely bare. No furniture, no pictures on the walls, nothing. Just an empty space with dust motes, floating in the sudden light. I stood there in shock, trying to process what I was seeing. How could this be? I'd heard noises coming from here just moments ago. I walked through the apartment, checking every room, but there was nothing. No sign that anyone had been there recently. As I stood in the middle of the empty living room, I heard a noise that made my blood run cold, footsteps coming from my apartment. I rushed back, my heart pounding, but when I got to my door, I found it locked, just as I'd left it. With shaking hands, I unlocked my door and went inside. Everything was exactly as I'd left it. TV still paused on my show, half-empty glass of wine on the coffee table. But the footsteps continued, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I spent that night at a hotel, too freaked out to stay in my apartment. The next day, I went back, half expecting to find my place ransacked or occupied by some squatter. But everything was normal. The footsteps, the noises had stopped. Over the next few days, I talked to more of my neighbors, asking if they'd ever experienced anything strange in the building. Most of them looked at me like I was crazy, but one older resident who'd lived there for decades hesitated before answering. He told me that years ago, long before Mrs. Fitzgerald had moved in, there had been a young couple living in that apartment. The husband had been abusive, and one night things had gone too far. He had killed his wife and then himself. The building had been unable to rent out the apartment for years afterward because of its history. I don't know if I believe in ghosts or supernatural occurrences. I consider myself a pretty rational person. But living next to that empty apartment, hearing those inexplicable noises night after night has shaken my skepticism. I stayed in that apartment for another 6 months before finally deciding to move. In that time, the noises continued sporadically. Sometimes I'd go weeks without hearing anything, and then suddenly the footsteps and muffled sounds would start up again. I never saw anything concrete, never had any ghostly encounters or visual phenomena. Just those persistent, unexplainable noises from an empty apartment. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.